Welcome back to the program. Joining me now live from Melbourne is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Josh Frydenberg. Thanks for joining us, Josh.
Nice to be with you, Chris.
Look, we know that Cabinet has approved military action in the Middle East. The Defence Minister has said today that the appropriate authorities and arrangements have come from the Iraqi government, so our F/A-18 Super Hornets are ready to go in the Middle East as we speak. Do you expect that? Do you have any update on that? Do we know if they're going to be sent out on any strike missions tonight?
Look, the government's reluctant, of course, to put any exact timetable on it, other than to say, as David Johnson has mentioned publicly, that all the risk assessments are done, the air wing's been deployed, the special forces are in place, the Prime Minister has been in regular touch with his counterparts overseas, namely President Obama, David Cameron in the UK, and of course Haider al-Abadi in Iraq. And Australia has been very purposeful in its preparations, but this is not going to be a 1 week or indeed maybe even a 1 month campaign. This is going to be a much longer contribution because
indeed,
the threat is very real.
Defence Minister David Johnson today has talked about months rather than years, though. He's talked about optimism in terms of getting the job done quickly. It's a matter, though, of defining exactly what the job is. There is a fair amount of strategic ambiguity about what Australia's mission is here.
Well, it's clearly our mission to degrade and hopefully ultimately destroy ISIL as a force that can make rapid advances both in Iraq and Syria, as we have recently seen them do.
In Iraq and Syria? So far, Tony Abbott has ruled out any action by Australians in Syria.
We are not participating in any actions in Syria, but obviously the Americans have been. But what we saw with the fall of Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq, is ISIL take the bank where there was hundreds of millions of dollars that they were able to use to deploy for the acquisition of advanced weaponry. They've also taken possession of weaponry from the Iraqi army, and as they take more towns, as they take strategic spots like dams and refineries, and they're able to trade then on international markets through back channels, they are able to equip this well-armed fighting machine, and we need to stop that. The reason why it's hard to put an exact time frame on the commitment is because we are fighting a difficult enemy, one which may number around 30,000. The time frame is one thing. Time frame is one thing. We don't even really know. The Australian public haven't even been really told exactly what the end point is, what we want the situation to look like when it's time for us to come home. For instance, you talk about Iraq and Syria. There could be a situation where Islamic State is pushed completely out of Iraq and the Iraqi government, with support, is able to re-establish security within its borders, but you still have the Islamic State terrorists creating enormous problems and bloodshed in Syria. In those circumstances, would Australia pack up and come home? Would our mission be accomplished, or would we find some reason to stay there? Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. You are right to say one of our goals is to get the Iraqi army to recapture its territory, to assert its control, and Tony Abbott has publicly said that. As for Syria, we don't want to see the situation where we currently have seen a massive humanitarian crisis. We've seen beheadings and crucifixions, and ISIL being able to set itself up to become a terrorist state within an existing state. We don't want that to happen. But as for how long it will take to get to that end game is really an open question. What we saw just yesterday, Chris, was the Turkish Parliament take an important vote, 298 to 98, in favour of taking the steps which may lead to Turkey being part of a retaliatory action against ISIL. Now, Turkey is an important neighbour of Syria and Iraq, and the fact is it has an established army of over 600,000 military personnel. So if you get Turkey involved, together with Saudi, together with Qatar, together with Jordan, together with the French, the Brits, the Americans, and of course Australia and others, that is an overwhelming international force that I think can make massive inroads into degrading ISIL's capability.
Well, call it ISIL, call it ISIS, call it Islamic State, whatever name you like to choose. What we're actually fighting against is the latest manifestation of extremist Islamic terrorism in that region. We've seen it before with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, we've seen it in Yemen as we speak, we've seen it under the Taliban in Afghanistan. What's our long-term strategy to deal with that sort of extremist militancy in the Middle East once ISIS is dealt with? I mean, there needs to be a long-term strategy, doesn't there? Or we're going to be sending troops back there to deal with the latest outbreak every 5 years.
I think I want to make 3 points there. Firstly, there is an interdependence between this rise of extremism that we've seen under ISIL's nose in Iraq and Syria and the threat back here in Australia. There's no doubt about that, and that's why we need to be part of this international coalition. There's also a growing awareness among states in the Middle East themselves about this form of extremism and Sunni jihadism. And you've seen countries like Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Qatar and the United Arab Emirates and indeed Turkey start to speak out and take actions to ensure that this extremism doesn't spread, because it's been attracting foreign fighters from those countries into that crucible in Iraq and Syria. And then the third point is what we need to do here at home, and that is to work with the Islamic community to try to weed out the extremists and to ensure that they are punished and that we encourage the moderate voices. Now, we have seen some pretty worrying signs over recent weeks in Australia, with an 18-year-old extremist being killed after attacking a federal police officer and a Victorian police officer. We've seen 3 Australians go over to the Middle East to become suicide bombers, and then of course we've seen widespread investigations and also arrests across Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne by our intelligence agencies. This shows you the real threat that we are facing here in Australia, and we're not beating it up for political purposes. Neither the Labor Party or the Liberal Party would say that. Only the extremes in the Greens would say that.
Well, I was going to come to that. Yeah, I certainly wouldn't put that to you. You've got bipartisan support from the Labor Party. It's been very solid and forthright so far. But you do have the Greens making 2 key points. They're opposed to this action. They're vehemently opposed to this action. Their 2 key points are that Australia is just doing America's bidding, that we're just being a lapdog to America, and also that doing that we're going to increase the terror threat here at home. Now, they're getting quite a bit of airplay with those attacks.
Well, let me make 2 points in response to that. The Greens have historical amnesia. They forget that 9/11 occurred before any actions in Iraq. They forget that more than 80 Australians lost their lives in Bali before any actions in Iraq in 2002. We are a terrorist target because of our values, because of our secular society, our pluralist society, and the Greens just simply do not understand that. And then the second point is about the Americans. The Americans are actually putting their own people on the line, and they're spending their own resources in order to support and defend a Muslim state, namely Iraq, and Haider al-Abadi, the Prime Minister of Iraq. And the Greens fail to understand that they can have on the one hand an open arm to people who are the subject of persecution, but then when Australia goes abroad to try to stop that persecution, the Greens are nowhere to be seen. And the Greens should have to be held to account, Chris, for the fact that they have no answer to the fact that over 160,000 Kurds have flooded into Turkey in just the last few days because of the threat of ISIS. Now, those people are refugees now, and unless Australia participates in an international coalition to stem the tide of ISIL, then we'll see more people who will be subject to persecution and become refugees.
The Greens, though, do have one point. One point, that is when they talk about the US alliance, sure, when they talk about terms of being a lapdog and just doing America's bidding, that is crazy. But the alliance consideration must have been a strong consideration for Australia's decision to join this coalition of nations in the Middle East. Certainly, Cabinet would have considered, would it not, that it was an alliance responsibility to stand with the US and other nations in this action.
Well, I obviously wasn't at that table at the National Security Committee when they discussed the pros and the cons of Australia participating in an international action against ISIL. But of course, the alliance is the bedrock of our security. It underpins Australia's security. It involves, America being prepared to deploy to our part of the world, and that protects Australia. So we're always very conscious of that commitment that the Americans have made, but also, what has to be underlined about Australia's commitment here in Iraq is that there is a terrorist threat that has spread to Australia as a result of the extremism in the Middle East, and it's that interdependence that we have to stop.
When we talk about the Greens and talk about them saying that this is going to increase the terror threat, it's really dangerous and inflammatory stuff that they're actually putting into the public sphere, in my view, because they're basically saying Australia brings this terror threat upon itself, which is a very dangerous thing to be saying. Are you concerned that they get too much unquestioning airplay with those views, especially from the government's own taxpayer-funded broadcaster?
Well, they can make their views, but no one should take them seriously, let alone the ABC.
But they're taken very seriously on the ABC. As you know, they're given a lot of airplay, a lot of support, even from people who host their programs.
And as you know, on the ABC, they'll invite guests on regular appearances who, always criticise the United States and Israel as the source of every problem in the Middle East, forgetting that there's a Shiite-Sunni split, which is actually at the root cause of this sectarian violence that we're seeing. So, I don't think those voices are credible at all, and I don't think we should take the Greens seriously.
Yeah, well, certainly the government-funded media seems to take them extremely seriously, which is my point. You might want to have a word to your colleagues about just how to deal with the ABC. That's a bigger issue than we can cover here tonight. I do want to talk, though, about the government's own actions, especially through the presiding officers of the Parliament, the President of the Senate, Stephen Parry, and the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Bronwyn Bishop. Their decision last week to effectively segregate women in burqas if they came into Parliament, women in burqas or niqabs, that was just a dumb and silly and, again, inflammatory decision to make, wasn't it?
Well, let's put some facts on the table, Chris. Firstly, it was an interim...
You'd agree it was a dumb and inflammatory decision to make?
Well, I don't think we should be segregating Australians in our Parliament. But let's put some facts on the table. Firstly, this was an interim decision. Secondly, the Prime Minister very quickly, as soon as he heard about this, has made it clear to the presiding officers that he hopes that they rethink their interim decision. Third, it is contingent upon further advice from our security agencies. And fourth, we have said that this issue will be resolved before Parliament comes back in a fortnight. So let's just put that in perspective. The real issue is not burqas. The issue is extremism and rooting out that extremism, whether it's overseas or here in Australia.
Well, exactly. So why would the Speaker and the President make a decision that once someone comes through security, they're checked, they would have to sit in a separate area? It just fuels the sorts of silly debates that we don't really need at the moment.
Well, as you've heard, a lot of coalition voices have said this is not something that they would support, but it is something that now is being hopefully reconsidered by the presiding officers. But again, the burqas are not the problem here. The issue is extremism, and we need to work with both, obviously, our law enforcement, our intelligence community, but also with the local Muslim community to ensure that the moderate voices are heard and fully supported.
Are you worried about cohesiveness in the Australian community? Are you worried about the tensions that we're starting to see play out? You're a member of the Jewish community in Melbourne. You've seen some of these tensions play out over various issues at various times, very heightened. Are you concerned about where it's heading at the moment?
I'm concerned about the threat levels. Obviously, they've gone up on the advice from security agencies, and we've seen those raids across Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne. So there's no beating around the bush here, Chris. This is a very serious challenge for the government and for Australia. That is of concern. But I believe there are a lot of good people in the community, whatever their religion, who want to see those extremists weeded out, and I think that will occur, and we will maintain not only harmony but will also enhance our security.
Now, of course, the government's still dealing with the budget issues and the budget repair job, and these additional resources into domestic security as well as the deployment to Iraq look like affecting the budget bottom line by at least $1 billion. Matthias Cormann saying he's not ruling anything in or out, but we're headed towards a blowout in the deficit, aren't we? There's no way known the government could possibly increase taxes again.
Well, Matthias Cormann's comments today were eminently sensible. A government doesn't want to rule anything in or out, but we make two unequivocal commitments to the Australian people. One, we will bring fiscal responsibility to the government's finances for the first time.
Doesn't that mean, though, if you're heading for additional budget pressure, the very first thing that should happen, the very first thing on the chopping block should be the extra generous paid parental leave scheme? You could save some money that way and save having to put up taxes or cut elsewhere.
Good try, Chris. We're committed to the paid parental leave scheme as well as a number of our other social policy measures. But we first and foremost are committed to bringing back some responsibility and prudence to the balance sheet of the Commonwealth. And second, we will do everything in our powers to ensure the safety and security of the Australian people. And if that means spending more than $600 million extra on our law enforcement intelligence agencies, if that means a major commitment to Iraq and the deployment of our Air Force there and our Special Forces, we will do it. I don't believe those two goals of fiscal responsibility and national security are mutually exclusive. They're not. We can do them both, and we can return the budget back to surplus. But let's not misunderstand the nature of the task ahead of us. We have had to find savings right across the board. Labor's been hugely irresponsible in not sitting down at the table with us and supporting some of our measures.
Yeah, the point is that the task is getting more difficult, not less difficult as time goes on. Josh Frydenberg, thanks very much for joining us again on Viewpoint. I just want to point out to viewers, though, that since last time you joined us on this program, you've had some very, very happy news and that you've become a father for the first time. You and Amy have had a lovely baby, Gemma, so congratulations.
Thanks, Chris. It's keeping us all up at night, but it's a great joy. She's a great joy.
That's great. That's great. You managed to get through the interview anyway, even without sleep.
Thanks very much, Chris.
Thanks very much. That's Josh Frydenberg, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister. We'll have a break now, and when we come